He said he'd fix it, Ryan texted. Then silence swallowed everything. The message glowed like a tiny moon, bright and useless, mocking hope. I stared until after midnight, imagining his grin behind reckless promises. Wind kept rattling the kitchen screen, a loose breath, a warning. Our father's portrait watched from the hallway, stern eyes framed in walnut, inheritance paperwork sprawled across the table like exhausted birds. Ryan had sworn, "I'll make it right by morning, Celia." My thumb hovered over call, then over prayer, then settled on nothing. When the phone finally rang, it wasn't Ryan, it was fear. A deputy said they'd found his car idling near the cliffs. I drove there with night chewing the road, tires humming a dirge. The ocean was a black lung, heaving, coughing flecks of froth onto rocks. Red and blue lights painted the guardrail, brittle as stage makeup. An officer lifted tape. Salt cut my throat like ground glass. His sedan purred obediently, doors locked, driver's seat still warm. His wallet sat in the console, cash folded like sleeping moths. The key fob blinked a dumb heartbeat, refusing to understand absence. "We're searching the shoreline," the deputy said, voice careful, palms open. I whispered, "He can't swim," and thought about promises that drown. The inheritance file weighed heavy on my arms, accusation bound in paper. Our stepfamily had divided the Hartman estate like vultures measuring bones. Ryan hated conflicts, yet loved dramatic solutions and impossible midnights. He'd said, "Give me tonight, I'll fix everything they stole." I pictured him meeting someone, passing copies, trading truth for danger. His scent clung to the car, cedar cologne and peppermint gum. In the cup holder, a receipt showed coffee purchased at 11. On the passenger seat, a single cufflink, obsidian with a silver crescent. Ryan didn't own cufflinks. He joked, ties were leashes for fools. That small crescent glimmered like a wink from something mean. Lauren arrived fast, heels clicking like clocks, eyes glossy with shock. She touched the window, smeared fog, and turned her face away. "You fought with him yesterday," she said, voice spun thin. "Over the will, over everything, not yours." Her accusation grazed me, but the cliffs roared louder than gossip. I remembered Ryan's laughter spilling through summers, his hand steadying my handlebars. After our father remarried, warmth turned like milk left out. Promises curdled, birthdays missed, then legal letters that bled ink. Yet Ryan called last night, low and fierce. "I found something," he promised. "By morning, you'll breathe easy, I swear." Searchlights combed the surf, slow teeth scraping foam, finding nothing human. Officers conferred, murmurs flicking like moths around terrible bulbs. Lauren clutched her coat closed, diamonds biting the throat's soft hollow. "He wouldn't leave me," she said, "more to the sea than me." I noticed sand in her hem, wet ribboning higher than rain. The deputy asked for statements. Words felt heavier than soaked wool. I described the text, the fight, the promise, the missing hours. The cufflink burned my pocket like a coin from hell. I looked at the cliffs, then the car, then Lauren's shaking hands. "I have to know the truth," I breathed, and the sea listened. The next morning, fog crawled across the property like uninvited breath. The police left muddy footprints and polite condolences, promising updates that would never come. I stood at the dining table, the will spread open beside cold coffee. Ryan's handwriting haunted the margins, little arrows, small jokes, a doodle of our father's watch. The legal language felt colder than the ocean that took him. Lauren sat opposite me, mascara bruised under her eyes, her tone brittle. "They think he jumped," she whispered. "That guilt can swim faster than love." I said nothing, only traced the ink where Ryan had written my name, then scratched it out. It was too deliberate to be confusion. That night, I wandered the hallway barefoot, the floor sighing like it missed him too. The portrait of father seemed different, lips twisted as if he wanted to warn me. My phone kept flashing news alerts, each more hollow than the last. "Local man missing. Search continues. Possible suicide." None said his name right. I replayed our last call, the static between his words. "I found the proof, Celia," he'd said. "I'll fix it before they do." I asked who they were, but he'd only laughed, that soft, infuriating laugh that always meant secrets. By the third day, the house smelled like salt and lies. Neighbors brought casseroles and condolences, eyes flicking between pity and suspicion. Lauren avoided me now, whispering to strangers on her phone. I caught her outside, murmuring, "Yes, it's done," before she noticed me watching. Just the funeral arrangements. she said quickly, but the lie fell apart before it hit the air. I smiled the way grief does, sharp and silent. I told her I'd handle the lawyer myself. Her pupils tightened, just slightly, like she'd heard a trapdoor open. When the lawyer called, his voice held too much sugar. "Such a tragedy, Miss Hartman," he sighed. "But you'll be relieved to know the estate is now settled." I asked him to repeat that, to say the word settled again. He stumbled, papers rustling, then hung up. The line clicked like a lock turning. My pulse tripped and fell through me, cold and precise. I opened Ryan's desk drawer and found nothing, every flash drive, every document gone. Only a torn envelope remained, sealed with a thumbprint smudge that wasn't his. I drove to the cliffs again at dusk. The tide had receded, leaving the rocks slick and exposed. I imagined Ryan standing here, wind clawing at his coat, eyes bright with revelation. Maybe he'd met someone. Maybe he'd trusted the wrong hand. The cufflink still rested in my pocket, heavier with every heartbeat. "You said you'd fix it," I whispered into the wind. "So why did you vanish instead?" The ocean offered no answer, only the rhythm of promises broken twice. I turned away from the edge and made myself a vow that felt like steel. "I have to know the truth." The town began to forget him faster than I could. Headlines shrank, sympathy cooled, and silence grew teeth. Every morning I checked the shoreline reports, hoping for something, a clue, a body, even a rumor. But nothing surfaced except questions that smelled like rot. The lawyer stopped returning my calls. Lauren packed her things in boxes too small for memory. She moved out within a week, saying she couldn't breathe in this haunted place. I didn't stop her. "Let the house keep its ghosts. They belong to me now." At night I replayed Ryan's voice from old voicemails, grainy and kind. "You're overthinking again, Celia." "Trust me for once," I whispered back into the static. I did. Look where it got us. The first clue came wrapped in something ordinary, an email notification from Ryan's old account. The subject line read, "Draft autosaved." My breath caught. I opened it to find a half-written message addressed to someone named M. Delane. The words stopped mid-sentence. The forged clause. They think I don't know. No attachment, no signature, just that dangling truth like a pulse without a body. I stared at it until my eyes burned, then printed it out, hands trembling. The date stamp was from the night he disappeared, exactly an hour before the police found his car. That timing wasn't coincidence, it was choreography. I whispered his name and felt the house lean closer, listening. I went to the lawyer's office the next morning, clutching the email like a weapon. His assistant said he'd taken a personal leave, a phrase that sounded borrowed from crime, dramas. I waited anyway, pacing the marble floor under chandeliers that hummed with quiet deceit. After 2 hours, I left and drove to the old cafe Ryan used to haunt. The barista remembered him, smiled faintly, then frowned. "He was here that night," she said. "Met a woman. Blonde, sharp coat, red lipstick. Left together around 11. My heart dipped. 11 was the timestamp on the coffee receipt found in his car. I asked if she heard a name, but she shook her head. He looked nervous, though, like he was walking into a storm. Later that day, I found myself parked outside Lauren's new apartment, hidden behind half-drawn curtains. Her laughter floated from inside, brittle, forced. Through the window, I saw her on a call, pacing, gesturing with a cigarette. I could read her lips enough to see one word form again and again. Money. My hand closed around the cufflink in my pocket. The crescent gleamed faintly, catching the dull afternoon light. I noticed a tiny engraving on the edge I hadn't seen before. L. G. Lauren Graves. The initials landed like thunder. My mind split between disbelief and fury. If the cufflink was hers, what had she been doing at the cliffs? That night I sat on the porch, wind tugging at my hair, the sea muttering in its sleep. My memory folded backward to the day Father remarried, Ryan slipping me a paper ring and saying, "No matter what happens, we stay a team." We'd been 10 and 12, foolish and loyal. I never thought we'd need that promise for something darker. I could still see his grin when he'd said he'd fix everything. Maybe he really believed it right until someone made sure he couldn't. I pressed the cufflink against my palm until it cut, blood beaded, small and honest. "You didn't drown," I said softly. "Someone made you disappear. Sleep wouldn't come." My thoughts ran wild in circles, sharp as glass. Each clue was a thread tightening around something unseen. I no longer felt grief, only movement, hunger, purpose. Tomorrow, I would start asking the right questions. I wasn't afraid anymore. Paranoia was gone. Only resolve remained. Morning came harsh and colorless, a sky stretched thin over secrets. I brewed black coffee strong enough to burn the throat, needing its violence to stay steady. My kitchen table had become a crime board: maps, notes, the printed email, and that cursed cufflink. Each piece whispered Ryan's name differently, but none gave him back. I took a notebook, wrote Lauren. Lawyer, M. Delane. The pen stuttered over the last one. Who was M. Delane? And why did Ryan trust them? I searched his phone backup for messages, found a number saved under Marcel D. My stomach tightened when the area code traced back to the same district as the law firm. That wasn't random. I called, disguising my voice the way anxiety disguises guilt. A smooth tone answered, male, cautious. Marcel Delane speaking. I froze for half a breath, then said, "This is Celia Hartman. I think you were in contact with my brother before he disappeared." Silence cracked like dry wood. He replied, "I told him not to involve you." The air left my chest. "Involve me in what?" I asked, but he hung up. I called again, no answer. The click echoed through the room, a door locking from inside. My fingers trembled, part rage, part revelation. Ryan hadn't just found a forged clause, he'd found the architect behind it. I drove to the courthouse archives, the walls humming with the ghosts of signatures and ink. A clerk named Denise, kind-eyed and weary, helped me search through old estate revisions. "Your father's will was updated 3 times, she said. Once before his stroke, once after, and a third oddly after his death, notarized by your family lawyer. My pulse stuttered. "That's impossible," I said, but Denise only shrugged. "People do strange things for money, Miss Hartman." She printed the record. The signature at the bottom wasn't father's, it was forged. I could see the hesitation in the H, the wrong loop in the R. Ryan had been right all along. I left the courthouse shaking, cold with something sharper than grief. Outside, the air smelled like exhaust and betrayal. I called Jonas Merrick, an old friend of Ryan's from college, now a journalist with too much curiosity. He picked up on the third ring. "Celia? You sound like hell." I told him everything: the email, the cufflink, the forgery. He whistled low. "If the will's fake, someone powerful signed off on it. And if Ryan found proof, they had motive to silence him." I asked if he could help trace Delane. "And I'll dig," he said. "But if you're right, you're poking at a nest full of snakes." His warning felt almost tender. I hung up before fear could talk me out of it. That night, thunder rolled over the cliffs like a restless promise. I sat by the window, watching lightning carve the ocean into jagged mirrors. My reflection looked like someone I didn't recognize, sharper, colder. The phone buzzed once. A blocked number. A text. "Stop looking. You're next." I stared until the letters blurred. Then I laughed, a sound brittle enough to cut the dark. "You made one mistake," I whispered to the night. "You didn't finish the job. Sleep never came. Only plans." I wrote names over and over: Lauren, Delane, the lawyer, until they lost shape and meaning. Ryan's ghost wasn't whispering anymore. He was watching. I could feel him in the corners of every room, urging me forward. I would find the truth even if it burned every bridge left. Fear was gone now. I had crossed it. Only action remained. Jonas arrived that evening with eyes that looked like insomnia. His trench coat dripped rain onto the porch, and the smell of wet asphalt clung to him. "You weren't kidding," he muttered, scanning the mess of notes spread across my table. He picked up the cufflink, turning it under the lamp's yellow glow. "Lauren Graves," he read, voice low. "That's your stepbrother's fiancée, right?" I nodded, arms crossed, pulse steady. He whistled softly. "Then she's either mourning in expensive jewelry or lying in it." He poured himself coffee without asking, his hands rough and restless. "Let's start by tracing this Marcel Delane," he said, pulling out his laptop. The screen's blue light painted both our faces with equal suspicion. We found Delane listed as an associate under the family lawyer's firm, a mid-level executor who'd handled revisions of multiple estates. "He's the one who notarized the third will," Jonas said, scrolling fast. "But there's more. He resigned 3 days after your brother vanished." My breath caught. "That's not a resignation. That's flight." Jonas nodded. "And it gets better. He transferred $200,000 to a private account in the Cayman Islands the same week. The evidence bloomed in front of me like poison flowers. Ryan had uncovered this, tried to confront them, and vanished for it." Jonas leaned back, rubbing his temples. "You realize you're in danger if you keep digging, right?" I smiled faintly, bitterness curling the edges. "He's already gone. What's left to lose?" He stared at me, then sighed. Okay, then we do this my way. We find the leak, follow the money, and expose every name on that ledger. His confidence felt like borrowed armor, cold but useful. For the first time since Ryan disappeared, the air around me didn't feel entirely empty. We worked until midnight, piecing together timelines, cross-checking transactions, mapping connections that looked like veins on a sick heart. The next morning, Jonas called. His voice trembled with both triumph and fear. "Celia, you need to see this." We met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that never asked names. He slid a file across the table. Inside were photographs, grainy security stills from a marina near the cliffs. The timestamp matched the night Ryan vanished. The images showed two figures, Ryan unmistakable in his dark jacket, and a woman in a tailored coat, hair tied back, face obscured. In the final frame, she turned slightly toward the camera. The side profile was unmistakable. Lauren. The coffee in my hand cooled instantly. My pulse pounded loud enough to drown the jukebox hum. "You're sure?" Jonas nodded. "Facial match is 90%. She was there." He hesitated before adding, "And there's something else. The license plate of the car parked near them? It belongs to Delane." The diner seemed to shrink around me, walls bending with revelation. Every suspicion I'd swallowed now screamed for air. "So, she lied," I said softly. "She was with him, and then he disappeared." My reflection in the chrome napkin holder looked like someone forged from grief and gasoline. Jonas placed his hand over mine. "We take this to the police." I shook my head. "No, not yet. They'll twist it, lose it, or bury it." I folded the photos carefully, sliding them into my coat pocket like a secret blade. "Ryan trusted the wrong people. I won't." My voice felt unfamiliar, steady, cold, absolute. Jonas didn't argue. He only said, "Then you're in this alone." I stood, paid for the untouched coffee, and met his tired eyes. I've been alone since that night. Outside, rain began again, soft, persistent, like the world trying to wash something it could never cleanse. I spent the next day pretending to live a normal life, which felt like wearing someone else's skin. I cleaned the house, opened windows, made tea, all mechanical, all meaningless. Beneath that calm surface, my mind kept replaying the marina photos like a broken film reel. Lauren and Delane, side by side, hours before Ryan vanished. The same night he'd texted me, promising he'd fix everything. Every motion I made had gravity now. Every silence had weight. When the lawyer's office finally reopened, I was already waiting in the parking lot before sunrise, the cufflink heavy in my coat pocket. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with the kind of politeness meant to deflect confrontation. "Mr. Hendricks isn't in," she said, smiling too quickly. I smiled back slower, sharper. "Then I'll wait." 2 hours later he appeared, startled but trying to mask it. His tie was loose. His eyes ringed. "Celia," he began, "you shouldn't be here. Did Ryan confront you before he disappeared?" I asked. His jaw tightened, throat working. "He came by, yes. He was upset, said things that didn't make sense." I stepped closer. "He said the will was forged. He said he had proof." The color drained from his face like ink in water. "That's absurd," he stammered. "Your brother misunderstood. Then why did your associate resign and leave the country 3 days later?" I cut in. He froze. The silence was confession enough. I left before he could recover, heart pounding against ribs that felt too narrow. Outside, Jonas waited in his car, engine idling. I slid into the passenger seat. "He knows," I said quietly. Jonas nodded, eyes forward. "Then we're close." He handed me a flash drive. Pulled Delane's company emails before they wiped the server. There's a message thread between him and someone labeled LG. They were negotiating percentages. My stomach turned. "She helped forge the will for money." Jonas's voice was low, almost apologetic. "Looks that way. He promised her 50% of your share after the estate settled." We sat in silence, the weight of betrayal pressing down like fog. Ryan had died trying to protect something I hadn't even known I'd lost. "We need proof that ties her to his disappearance," I said finally. Jonas hesitated. "There's more. Delane booked a one-way ticket to Nassau the morning after the car was found, and guess who paid for it?" I met his eyes, already knowing. "Lauren." He nodded. "Charged to her platinum card." My hands went cold. She cleaned her tracks, but not enough. I looked out the window. The ocean glimmered faintly in the distance, beautiful and cruel. "Ryan trusted her," I murmured. "She killed that trust, maybe him with it." That night I returned home and spread everything across the table. Emails, receipts, photos, forged signatures. The house felt different now, more awake, as if it recognized the truth bleeding through its walls. I found Ryan's old voice recorder in his drawer, the one he used for meetings. When I pressed play, static filled the air, followed by his voice, tired, hushed, scared. "If something happens to me, check the lawyer's office. The proof's there. Don't trust Lauren." My chest seized. Tears came hot and silent. He had known. He had tried to protect me even from her. By dawn, my decision was made. Revenge wasn't impulse anymore, it was structure. I printed copies, labeled folders, and locked them in a metal box. I wasn't just chasing truth now, I was building justice, piece by deliberate piece. "You wanted to fix it, Ryan," I whispered. "Now I will." Outside, the sea began to rise again, restless, echoing the storm forming inside me. The truth landed like a slow explosion. Every clue I'd uncovered finally aligned, jagged pieces forming a picture I didn't want to see. The forged will, the wire transfers, the night at the marina, they all spiraled back to one moment. Ryan had met Lauren and Delane to confront them, to force a confession, and instead, they silenced him. I imagined that confrontation, rain slicking his jacket, words sharp as glass. Lauren, her voice sweet with poison, promising to explain. Delane lurking nearby, calm, calculating. They hadn't planned for him to fight back, hadn't planned for the struggle near the edge. But Ryan never made it home. The police called that morning. They'd closed the active investigation due to lack of evidence. "We'll classify it as a missing person," the detective said, his tone clinical. I laughed, low and cracked. "Missing implies someone's looking," I told him, but he'd already hung up. I stood there, holding the dead phone, the world suddenly colder. The sea outside the window looked endless and mocking. I could almost see Ryan's reflection in the waves, silent, waiting for me to finish what he started. Jonas came over, worry etched deep into his face. "You can't fight this alone," he said. "They'll bury you in paperwork before they ever admit fault." I handed him the voice recording, the emails, the photos. "Then I'll dig deeper. Paper cuts bleed too," he sighed. "Celia, vengeance eats people alive." I met his eyes. "Then I'll let it." My calm scared even me. There was no trembling anymore, just precision. I returned to the lawyer's office after hours, breaking the small latch on his back window with a crowbar wrapped in cloth. The alarm system blinked red but didn't sound. Jonas had looped the circuit through a temporary bypass. Inside, the office smelled of polish and deceit. I moved straight to the filing cabinet labeled Hartman Estate. Most drawers were empty, recently cleared, but one folder remained at the bottom, bent, stained with coffee. Inside, I found copies of Ryan's letters to the firm, demanding transparency. One had a note scribbled in the margin in Hendrix's handwriting, "Contain situation. She must not find out." Tears blurred the ink until it ran like veins down the page. The truth wasn't supposed to come this way, not through theft, not through ghosts. I slipped the folder into my bag and turned toward the door. The sound of footsteps froze me mid-breath. "You shouldn't be here," a voice said from the dark. Lauren stepped into the dim light, hair tied back, face pale but composed. "You're making this worse for yourself." I stared at her, every word I'd ever swallowed pressing behind my teeth. "Tell me what happened to him." Her lips trembled. "It was an accident." The words cracked open something primal inside me. "You pushed him," I said quietly. "You pushed him because he found out." She looked away, and that silence was answer enough. For a moment, I saw guilt flicker across her face, small, human, weak. "He wouldn't stop," she whispered. "He said he'd ruin everything." My vision tunneled, heartbeat pounding in my throat. "Everything," I repeated, stepping closer. "Everything you stole." She flinched. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." I almost pitied her, almost. Then I remembered Ryan's voice on the recorder, begging me not to trust her. I walked past her without another word. "You'll understand soon," I said, and meant every syllable. Outside, the air was colder than before, sharp enough to slice through grief. The ocean roared below, endless and alive, as if echoing his unfinished fight. The truth was no longer hidden, it was weaponized. I drove aimlessly that night, headlights cutting through rain that felt biblical. The world blurred into streaks of gray, every sound heavier than air. My mind kept replaying Lauren's trembling confession. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The words looped in my skull like a curse, scraping against reason. I pulled over at a rest stop, engine humming like a trapped animal, and pressed my forehead to the steering wheel. The truth was finally out, but instead of relief, I felt hollow. Ryan's death wasn't just murder, it was betrayal, born from greed and cowardice, a wound inflicted by those closest to him. My breath came sharp, shallow, as if grief itself refused to let me breathe. By dawn, I was back home, soaked and sleepless. The walls seemed to watch me, every framed photo now an accusation. I found Ryan's old sweater in the laundry room, folded neatly as if waiting. I sank to the floor, clutching it, breathing in the faint trace of his cologne. Memories flooded in uninvited our shared birthdays, his teasing grin, his promise that we'd always have each other. That promise was ashes now. My sobs came dry, no tears left to spend. When I finally stood, it wasn't sorrow moving me anymore. It was fury that felt like clarity. Jonas arrived mid-morning, took one look at me, and said, "You found something." I told him everything. Every word Lauren had said, every flicker of guilt in her eyes. He sat down heavily. "If we take this to the police, they'll twist it into manslaughter, maybe even self-defense." I shook my head. "They don't deserve the chance to define it." He leaned forward, voice low. "Celia, revenge won't bring him back." I met his gaze, calm, steady. "It's not about bringing him back. It's about balance." Jonas sighed, the kind of sigh that sounded like surrender. "Then at least be smart about it." We went over the evidence again, building a timeline with brutal precision. Ryan's confrontation, the forged will, the wire transfers, the marina. Every thread pointed to Lauren and Delane acting together, greed driving them, panic finishing the job. "They covered it up, but they left fingerprints," Jonas said, tapping the photos. "You can use them." I nodded, already miles ahead in my mind. "I will, but not in court. Not yet." He frowned. "What are you thinking?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because saying it aloud would make it real. That evening, I visited the cliffs again. The sea stretched endless and cruel beneath a bleeding sunset. I stood where his car had been found, the wind clawing at my coat. "I know now," I said, softly, voice shaking only once. "I know what they did to you." The wind howled, almost approving. For a long time I stood there, letting the sound fill me until it became something else, resolve, maybe even peace. "You said you'd fix it," I whispered. "Now I'll finish it." When I returned home, I opened my laptop and began writing. A letter to the press, a dossier of proof, a carefully crafted leak designed to look anonymous. Photos, signatures, transfers, Lauren's initials on the cufflink, all laid out like an autopsy of greed. But the letter itself was something different. It began with Ryan's name and ended with one sentence: "The truth doesn't die quietly." I hit save, then printed copies. Each sheet felt heavier than paper, soaked with justice waiting to bloom. By midnight, the plan was no longer abstract. It was breathing beside me, whispering. Lauren had confessed to an accident, but accidents don't have bank accounts in the Caymans. They don't forge wills. They don't lie to police. Tomorrow, she would learn that I wasn't mourning anymore, I was remembering. And Ryan's memory had claws. Shall I continue with next block of the Chapter 5, Strategic Calm and Revenge Plan, to 700 words? Yes, ChatGPT can make mistakes. OpenAI dough. I drove aimlessly that night, headlights cutting through rain that felt biblical. The world blurred into streaks of gray, every sound heavier than air. My mind kept replaying Lauren's trembling confession. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The words looped in my skull like a curse, scraping against reason. I pulled over at a rest stop, engine humming like a trapped animal, and pressed my forehead to the steering wheel. The truth was finally out, but instead of relief, I felt hollow. Ryan's death wasn't just murder, it was betrayal, born from greed and cowardice, a wound inflicted by those closest to him. My breath came sharp, shallow, as if grief itself refused to let me breathe. By dawn, I was back home, soaked and sleepless. The walls seemed to watch me, every framed photo now an accusation. I found Ryan's old sweater in the laundry room, folded neatly as if waiting. I sank to the floor, clutching it, breathing in the faint trace of his cologne. Memories flooded in uninvited our shared birthdays, his teasing grin, his promise that we'd always have each other. That promise was ashes now. My sobs came dry, no tears left to spend. When I finally stood, it wasn't sorrow moving me anymore. It was fury that felt like clarity. Jonas arrived mid-morning, took one look at me and said, "You found something." I told him everything, every word Lauren had said, every flicker of guilt in her eyes. He sat down heavily. If we take this to the police, they'll twist it into manslaughter, maybe even self-defense. I shook my head. They don't deserve the chance to define it. He leaned forward, voice low. Celia, revenge won't bring him back. I met his gaze, calm, steady. It's not about bringing him back. It's about balance. Jonas sighed, the kind of sigh that sounded like surrender. Then at least be smart about it. We went over the evidence again, building a timeline with brutal precision. Ryan's confrontation, the forged will, the wire transfers, the marina. Every thread pointed to Lauren and Delane acting together, greed driving them, panic finishing the job. They covered it up, but they left fingerprints, Jonas said, tapping the photos. You can use them. I nodded, already miles ahead in my mind. I will, but not in court. Not yet. He frowned. What are you thinking? I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because saying it aloud would make it real. That evening, I visited the cliffs again. The sea stretched endless and cruel beneath a bleeding sunset. I stood where his car had been found, the wind clawing at my coat. I know now, I said. Softly, voice shaking only once. I know what they did to you. The wind howled, almost approving. For a long time I stood there, letting the sound fill me until it became something else, resolve, maybe even peace. You said you'd fix it, I whispered. Now I'll finish it. When I returned home, I opened my laptop and began writing. A letter to the press. A dossier of proof, a carefully crafted leak designed to look anonymous. Photos, signatures, transfers, Lauren's initials on the cufflink, all laid out like an autopsy of greed. But the letter itself was something different. It began with Ryan's name and ended with one sentence. The truth doesn't die quietly. I hit save, then printed copies. Each sheet felt heavier than paper, soaked with justice, waiting to bloom. By midnight, the plan was no longer abstract. It was breathing beside me, whispering. Lauren had confessed to an accident, but accidents don't have bank accounts in the Caymans. They don't forge wills. They don't lie to police. Tomorrow, she would learn that I wasn't mourning anymore, I was remembering. And Ryan's memory had claws. The night after I finalized the dossier, I sat alone in the study with soft lamplight. The house hummed around me like an audience holding its breath for the line. I methodically arranged folders by date, by signature, by the weight of each lie exposed. Each paper felt like a small victory, edges sharp and honest against my skin. I brewed tea and let the steam steady the tremor in my hands. I placed Ryan's sweater on the chair across from me, as if he watched the plan unfold. I lit a single candle and let its steady flame mark time in the dark. Outside, the ocean thrashed without mercy, a reminder of what we were up against. I whispered his name into the quiet and listened for an answer that never came. I did not cry. I cataloged my grief into acts that might become evidence. Morning found me calm in a way that scared me more than night's rage. I moved with intent, choosing my words and silences like tools for an exact job. I called in favors Jonas had earned over years of chasing truth for paper and ink. He brought me contacts who could verify wire transfers and experts who could authenticate signatures. Together, we built a chain the police could no longer ignore or twist into fiction. I traced every dollar to an account, every signature to a hand that did not belong to my father. We found shell companies, intermediaries, and a notary ledger with smudged fingerprints. Each discovery stitched a clearer picture of greed and cowardice baked into formal paper. I felt less like someone mourning and more like an executor of truth. I staged small performances to watch reactions like a scientist watching cells divide. I enrolled in a charity committee meeting. Lauren loved to attend, smiling with neutral lips. I let her see me, the quiet widow who'd found peculiar strength in sorrow. She watched me from a distance, posture perfect, eyes counting blessings like receipts. I learned her rhythms, where she laughed, whom she avoided, how she ordered her martini. In private, Jonas pulled records tying her platinum card to Delane's escape plan. The evidence was clinical, cold, and undeniable when stacked in order. I began leaving tiny breadcrumbs that shaped a narrative only the guilty would follow. Each breadcrumb was a calculated risk, baited with details meant to unsettle, not accuse. At night, I practiced the voice I would one day use to peel back their carefully applied smiles. The voice was steady, controlled, not vengeful but inevitable. I photographed documents in precise angles, stored encrypted copies in unexpected places. I made false calls that placed Lauren at certain events, then contradicted those times with security footage. I sent anonymous tips to journalists who respected Jonas, nudging stories toward questions the authorities could no longer ignore. I drafted a letter to the local paper, crafted to sound like a concerned neighbor, then saved it for the right hour. I also contacted a retired detective, a man with patience and a sense of old justice, and offered him what I knew as a puzzle he could not resist. He agreed to look, slowly and without fanfare, which suited my needs perfectly. There was a symbolic act I needed to do for myself before the plan could move into motion. I cleared the study of Father's oldest chair and sat in it alone for an hour, feeling the grain of wood under my palms. I read old letters he'd written before his illness, remembering a steadier time without forged signatures or greed. Then I took a small, deliberate pair of scissors and clipped the thread of the family crest from a cushion Lauren had once admired at a party. The fabric fell away like a small ceremonial severing. It was childish, perhaps, but it felt like an offering to the truth. I placed the crest in an envelope labeled "For Ryan" and slid it into the dossier. That tiny ritual steadied me in ways argument never could. By dusk, everything had structure and contingency. We had timelines, backups, and witnesses willing to speak under oath. I had planted narratives designed to force mistakes, to expose the guilty through their own arrogance. I felt both monstrous and necessary, a balance I had not chosen but accepted. I prepared to be patient, knowing patience could dismantle the most arrogant schemes. The house settled as if approving the plan I'd composed beneath its rafters. I breathed, steady and cold, and whispered, "This is for you," to a sweater that could no longer warm me. I sketched the revenge plan like an architect drafting surrender and storm. I needed a mechanism they would never expect or easily counter. I would weaponize finance and procedure, quiet as a scalpel and precise. I arranged for an anonymous audit into Hartman Holdings to begin under false pretenses. I hired an ethical whistleblower to appear as a concerned contractor with documents. I fed compliance teams a trail linking offshore transfers to Lauren's accounts. I ensured regulators would trigger automatic freezes and subpoenas without subjective delay. I wanted the law's machinery to seize their arrogance like a net. I planned the exposure to occur during a staged family probate meeting. I would sit there steady, dossier closed, and watch consequence arrive. I recruited 2 unlikely allies who preferred facts over spectacle and money. Jonas found a forensic accountant with a soft voice and relentless patience. The accountant agreed to follow paper trails that led directly to Cayman intermediaries. I also persuaded a retired banking compliance officer to simulate suspicious activity reports. They would flag Lauren's payments to Delane as structured evasion and then escalate. The escalation would force banks to issue holds and notify law enforcement units. Those holds would produce subpoenas that could not be delayed by friendly lawyers. The subpoenas would demand sworn testimony and documented receipts from Lauren. Those demands would make her defenses brittle and exposed. I wanted her signed records to contradict her public lies. Next, I manufactured a plausible reason for Lauren to produce incriminating paperwork herself. I created a bogus restoration grant application attached to Hartman Estate Philanthropy. I leaked the grant's existence to Lauren through a planted charity liaison. She cared about image and influence. She would pursue such a grant eagerly. The application required detailed financial disclosure and notarized signatures under penalty of perjury. Once she signed, those papers would become direct pieces of evidence tied to her identity. Simultaneously, the audit would trace the grant funds back to offshore accounts used in the forgeries. The 2 threads would converge in authoritative documents. Truth would arrive dressed in signatures and bank memos. I rehearsed every contingency with Jonas and the retired officer until moves felt automatic. We timed the compliance flags to coincide with the family probate meeting I scheduled under legal pretense. I sent anonymous tips to regulators and an external auditor who could not be bribed. We routed communications through secure channels to protect our anonymity. I also built an exit path if things went wrong, a legal firewall to insulate me temporarily. The plan relied on institutional momentum rather than dramatic confrontation. It would use obligation, not rage, to dismantle their cover. I felt a cold precision settle into my bones as the mechanism took shape. I prepared my public performance for the probate room like a calm before a gale. I rehearsed questions, practiced a neutral face, and memorized timelines coldly. When regulators arrived, they would present freezes and subpoenas without emotion or flourish. Lawyers would fumble as evidence forced their hands into honesty or culpability. Lauren's composure would crack under cross-sections of ledger tracings and notarized documents. Delaine's flight plans and bank transfers would be presented as incontrovertible facts. I imagined her voice trying to shape excuses and watching those excuses fail. My role would be simple: sit, breathe, and let truth speak in certified ink. I kept one intimate element solely for myself to balance the public mechanism. I would play Ryan's last voice note at the precise moment the freezes became official. The recording would humanize the paper and show motive in a small broken voice. It would make the courtroom feel less clinical and more like a graveside confession. The sound would puncture denial in a way spreadsheets could not. That moment would be my private mercy and final accusation. Then law would do its work, and I would finally let some breath return. I folded the plan into my hands like a map leading directly to them. The morning of the probate meeting felt orchestrated down to the coffee cups and the polished nameplates. I dressed in the same navy blazer Ryan once admired and loosened a stray thread he used to tease me about. I moved slowly, rehearsing neutral expressions, practicing the kind of calm that could hide a burning coal. Jonas arrived early with a small satchel of evidence, eyes shadowed and steady like a man who slept badly for purpose. The retired compliance officer waited by the courthouse door, his hands folded with patient certainty, weathered like old legal pads. I carried the dossier in a plain briefcase, nothing flashy, exactly like I planned to avoid sudden attention. The probate room smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper, authority and brittle civility mixing in the air. Family members took seats in the gallery, whispers like moth wings brushing against the hush. Lauren entered late, poised and immaculate, her smile practiced like armor and her hands too steady. She scanned the room and found her place, as if the world still turned for her illusions. We began with formalities, the judge calling names, lawyers coaxing statements from sleepy witnesses. I listened through the motions, feeling each moment stretch like a taut wire ready to sing. When the family's lawyer spoke, I slid my briefcase under the chair, fingers mapping the outline of the files within. Jonas sat beside me, a quiet presence and the only face that remembered nights of frantic searching. The retired officer planted himself casually near the registrar, eyes flicking to lists and schedules as if reading a map. I watched Lauren across the room. She laughed at the right times and nodded with practiced concern. The registrar announced a pause to allow the board to review recent compliance notifications. My throat tightened. The compliance officer rose and presented official-looking documents, hands steady as he laid them on the table. The room tilted toward those papers like iron to a magnet, lawyers straightening and leaning forward. Screens in the room flickered as auditors began. Their routine, and then I fed the sequence I had constructed months ago into the moment like a key. An official freeze notice blinked across the judge's monitor, then a subpoena, then a structured activity alert flagged by the bank. Eyes widened around the room, polite masks slipping to reveal confusion. The judge frowned, petitions shuffled, and the lawyer for the opposing family looked suddenly flustered, fingers searching for defenses like a man groping in the dark. Lauren's smile quivered, an almost invisible crack across porcelain. I sat motionless and watched the law move like a machine with teeth. The freeze hit accounts linked to shell corporations and then, staggeringly, to a card associated with Lauren's name. Papers were exchanged with the speed of a chain reaction, lawyers whispering into phones, statements arranged like dominoes. The room's calm dissolved into precise chaos. At the precise heartbeat I had planned, Jonas tapped my knee and slid a small battery-operated player under the table. I lifted it slightly and thumbed play, drawing the room's attention more by human sound than accusation. Ryan's voice came through thin and raw, telling the simple truth he'd recorded for me. The forgery, the meeting, the fear. Silence fell like a curtain ripped from its hooks. Faces went blank, then pale, then filled with the red bloom of panic. Lauren's hands fled to her throat as if sound could be smothered and yet did not stop. The lawyer stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair, eyes wide with desperate pleading. "Objection!" he mouthed, lips moving like a man reciting a prayer. The judge, unflappable until then, blinked, then called for clarity, his gavel thudding like a heartbeat trying to steady itself. As subpoenas were read aloud and bank holds confirmed, Lauren rose with the composure of someone practiced in performing innocence. She attempted to weave an explanation about charitable donations and mistaken transfers. The accountant produced trace logs that unraveled her story in small, undeniable stitches. Delaine's flight plans, the Cayman transfers, the encrypted memo chain each laid into the public record with the bluntness of law. The opposing lawyers scrambled, voices climbing into panic, their polite legalese switching into animal noise. I felt nothing like triumph. Instead, a fierce, cold relief settled over me like a cloak. For months, I had feared how hollow truth might feel, and now it steadied me. I watched Lauren's face closest as she realized adrenaline could no longer buy silence. Her eyes slid to the public gallery and found faces turned away. There was nowhere left for the lie to hide. When the hearing recessed for evidence verification, whispers rolled like low thunder through the hallways. Cameras I had planted earlier caught private gasps and private calls. Reporters, fed anonymous tips that felt like breadcrumbs, began to circle with polite hunger. My plan used institutions, not spectacle, and those institutions now moved with procedural certainty toward exposure. Jonas stood and squeezed my hand once, his look saying everything words could not. The retired officer placed a small envelope on my knee. Inside was a copy of Lauren's transaction signature, notarized and labeled for court. I looked at it and felt Ryan's presence like heat. He had wanted this to stop for me, perhaps hoped to fix it himself. Instead, the legal machinery took his notes and folded them into something that mattered. Outside, the sea continued its indifferent work, waves erasing footprints while the law wrote them into record. Cars and voices surged in patterns I had orchestrated and feared, proof that truth could be made inevitable. I walked out of the courthouse into bright air, feeling neither victor nor victim, only someone who had fulfilled a promise in a way Ryan could not. The plan had begun to bite, and consequence moved with the cold precision I had set in motion. My throat felt raw and empty, but my hands did not tremble. This was only the trap's first snap, and yet it sang like a bell. The courtroom emptied into a corridor thick with breath and camera clicks. I felt the dossier pulse like a living thing beneath my palm. Reporters circled, hungry as gulls around tossed bread, eager for any spill. Lauren's face was porcelain cracking under fluorescent light and legal scrutiny. Her mouth moved, her words sounded like borrowed feathers, light and useless. A bailiff escorted an official with navy cuffs to her side, paperwork crisp and final. Delane's name echoed down the hall like a subject pronounced guilty. I smelled coffee and lemon cleaner, civilization perfuming sudden cruelty into order. Jonas stood close, silent, his shoulder a steady island against small storms. I pressed my fingers into the briefcase, feeling the plan's echo in my bones. Outside, the plaza had crowded quickly, voices knitting into a chorus of accusation. Someone shouted Lauren's name like a summons to confession or blood. Cameras flashed, staccato fireflies, illuminating faces that wanted scandal and closure both. A woman in the crowd sobbed openly, grief folding into righteous outrage for reasons unknown. Security formed a polite wall that tried and failed to contain human noise. Lauren emerged, hands raised in practiced shock and contrition, smile an actor's last resort. She spoke to the microphones, voice steady, pleading for privacy beneath public glare. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, breath controlled but brittle at the edges. The microphones ate her words and turned them into headlines immediately, each syllable a blade. Then, irony arrived on two legs, stumbling and human, in the form of Delane. He appeared in handcuffs, escorted through the plaza like a marionette cut free at last. His face was neither docile nor repentant. It was surprised at being stopped by consequence. He'd thought money and movement could outrun accountability's slow feet. A detective read charges aloud, crisp and inevitable as winter air. Delane tried to craft a story about forged signatures and lonely decisions. His narrative dissolved under direct questions that demanded concrete receipts and bank logs. Phones around the plaza recorded every failing paragraph of his defense like court stenographers of the public. People leaned forward as if truth were a play they had paid to see. Lauren's composure pinched and then unraveled in small animal ways noticeable to everyone. She touched her throat, then her face, fingers searching for a mask that no longer fit. A journalist stepped closer with a printed ledger, page edges biting sunlight as evidence. "How do you explain this transfer?" he asked, voice sharp with inevitable satisfaction. Her eyes flicked like trapped birds between ledger numbers and the crowd's expectant faces. I can explain," she began, voice losing the practiced cadence my stepbrother once mocked. Jonas stepped forward quietly, laying a photograph on a nearby bench marina frames where her profile was unmistakable. The image landed in the public's hands like a small stone in still water, ripples widening instantly. At the same instant, a phone rang loudly in Lauren's pocket, its ringtone ridiculous and careless. She fumbled, handset between trembling fingers, the world watching her like a judge. The caller ID read Hendricks Law Firm, the very office that had smiled at us with dentures of civility. Her face went white, and she answered with a voice that tried to be casual and failed. "Hello?" she said, and the line released a recorded voice designed to undo her. The retired detective had arranged the call. Hendricks' recorded voicemail confessed obfuscations under pressure, a soft legalism exposed as guilt. The recorded admission landed precisely where proof needed it, in human ears and in public record. Lauren tried to speak again, and only small sounds came out, animal apologies without architecture. Chaos followed like a spill of ink across a white page, messy and impossible to tidy. Family members filed statements publicly, voices cracking between civility and accusation. Strangers offered condolences that felt like verdicts, each word a small execution of social standing. The judge reopened proceedings after new evidence prompted immediate review, gavel rasping like a metronome of justice. Lawyers argued, papers flew, and reporters rewired the narrative in real time. Bank compliance teams confirmed holds with official paper and legalese that sounded like thunder. People cried, some for Ryan, others for a loss of comfortable illusions. I stood still through it all, feeling the plan I built turn kinetic and true. Late into the afternoon, Lauren attempted a last-minute escape toward a waiting car, heels clicking like a guilty heartbeat. A reporter called after her, "Miss Graves, any comment?" Her driver flung open the door, hands shaking, the engine revving like impatience. But the planned freeze had done its work. The car keys failed, electronic locks stubbornly refusing obedience. She pounded the hood, glossy nails leaving desperate streaks, and then slumped into a small, human heap. The scene read like a tragic comedy, the vanity of ease stripped by procedural cold. Police moved gently, not cruelly, but with the inevitability of long-sought consequence. Onlookers whispered about poetic justice, the phrase tasting like iron and rain on their tongues. When evening fell, the plaza emptied slowly, leaving residue of scandal in folded newspapers and lit cigarette butts. Cameras packed up, flashes blinking off like exhausted stars. Jonas and I walked away with files heavier and lighter at once. Legal muscle now doing work my anger could not. I felt neither triumph nor peace, only the strange, quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. My hands smelled faintly of paper and sea salt, 2 cents now braided forever into my memory. Ryan's voice lived in the recording we played, and in the quiet between my breaths, a tether that had led me through ruined rooms to this small, sharp justice. The news broke before dawn, spilling across headlines like a slow confession. Heiress uncovers forged will. Fiancé and lawyer implicated in disappearance case. The photograph beneath the title showed me walking from the courthouse, eyes steady, jaw set. They called it determination. It was exhaustion. The story ran on every morning broadcast, snippets of Ryan's recording, blurred footage of Lauren's breakdown, a mugshot of Delane looking as if he'd aged a decade overnight. I watched from the kitchen, coffee untouched, the house wrapped in the kind of quiet that arrives after a storm. Outside, the sea looked deceptively calm, as though the world had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Inside, I felt every hour of the past months pressing down on my shoulders, heavy and certain, like the weight of something finally ending. By noon, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, lawyers, distant relatives, pretending concern wrapped in curiosity. I let every call go unanswered. Jonas arrived with 2 newspapers under his arm, his coat half-buttoned, eyes weary but bright. "They're calling it justice," he said, setting the papers on the table. "But they don't know half of what it took." I looked at him, voice flat. "They don't need to." He nodded, understanding that privacy had become my final inheritance. The retired officer phoned to confirm official statements were being filed. The district attorney's office had reopened Ryan's case, now labeled suspicious death pending charges. There would be hearings, investigations, maybe even a trial. The machinery of consequence had begun to turn on its own, no longer needing my push. That evening, I drove to the cliffs again. The police tape was gone, wind tearing freely across the edge. I stood where Ryan's car, once idled, headlights pointed into nothing, and closed my eyes. "It's done," I whispered. For the first time, the sea didn't sound angry. It sounded tired, maybe even forgiving. I dropped the remaining cufflink into the surf and watched it vanish without ceremony. Some part of me hoped the ocean would return it, a symbolic exchange. but it only took and kept. I stayed until the horizon dimmed and the first star blinked awake, faint but deliberate. Then I turned back toward home, where silence waited like a familiar friend. Days became structured again, quiet mornings, measured errands, long walks along the cliffs. Reporters eventually lost interest. The world moved on to newer scandals, fresher pain. Yet the town never fully stopped whispering. In grocery aisles and gas stations, I heard fragments, "She found him out. The money was cursed." Justice came slow but sharp. I didn't correct them. Let myth do what truth could not. Keep Ryan's name alive. Jonas published a long-form article 6 weeks later, factual but tender, avoiding sensationalism. The headline read, "The Promise Kept." He sent me a copy before it went to print. "Thought you should see it," his message said. I read it once, then folded the pages into a drawer with Ryan's letters. I didn't need the world's version of closure, I had mine. Lauren's trial began in early spring. She appeared smaller than I remembered, makeup muted, hair scraped into obedience. Her defense claimed coercion, emotional manipulation, desperation. Delane had already agreed to testify against her for a reduced sentence. His testimony painted greed in precise detail: the forged documents, the meeting at the marina, the argument that ended with panic and a fall. They couldn't recover Ryan's body, the current had taken too much, but the evidence, both digital and human, was undeniable. The courtroom air was heavy with grief and spectacle. When the judge read the verdict, guilty on counts of fraud and involuntary manslaughter, Lauren's knees buckled. I didn't look away. She met my eyes once before the bailiff led her away, a flicker of something like apology passing between us. It didn't matter. Apologies arrive too late when the dead can't hear them. After the trial, people called me brave. The word tasted strange. Bravery implies choice, and I had none. I had only Ryan's promise echoing through every sleepless night. "I'll fix it." I had only the cliff and the silence he left behind. The estate lawyers finalized the legitimate will within months. My father's holdings reverted to their rightful form: property, shares, artwork I'd never cared for. I signed documents without looking at numbers, my only thought to close the wound permanently. I created a foundation in Ryan's name, the Hartman Trust for Truth and Safety, dedicated to helping victims of financial manipulation and legal abuse. Jonas helped set up the framework, insisting the mission statement sound both human and unflinching. "Make it about courage," he said, "not revenge." I smiled, knowing the difference was often paper thin. The tabloids eventually softened, shifting from scandal to sentiment. "Sister turns tragedy into advocacy," one headline declared, printed over a photo of me standing beside the newly restored Hartman family home. I'd had it repainted a soft gray, the color of storm clouds ready to break. The portrait of our father still hung in the hallway, but I'd moved it lower, eye level, less imposing. Sometimes I caught myself speaking to it in passing. "He kept his word, you know," I'd say, just not the way he planned. The house felt different now, not empty, but quiet in a clean way. I filled the garden with lavender, Ryan's favorite scent, because he once said it smelled like peace trying to exist. The irony didn't escape me. One afternoon, as I sorted through files in the study, I found Jonas's old press pass tucked inside a folder labeled Evidence Keep. He'd left it there on purpose, maybe a farewell or a reminder. The phone rang him again. "You doing all right?" he asked. His voice carried the kind of fatigue that never truly leaves after long wars. "As close as anyone can be," I answered. He paused, then said, "You know, sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a door closing quietly where it should have slammed years ago." I looked out at the ocean, the horizon glinting with thin gold light. "Then maybe we finally closed it," I said. He laughed softly, tired but sincere. I think Ryan would have liked that. That night, sleep came easier. I dreamed of the cliffs, but not as a place of loss. In the dream, Ryan stood on the shore, barefoot, wind in his hair, smiling the way he did when we were kids. He didn't speak. He just nodded once, as if to say, "You did it." When I woke, morning light cut across the ceiling in clean lines, unburdened. I got up, brewed coffee, and stepped outside. The sea looked endless but no longer cruel. It felt like a mirror, deep, cold, but honest. Weeks later, I attended the unveiling of the Foundation's first scholarship recipient. The young woman who received it hugged me with trembling arms and whispered, "Thank you for fighting." Her voice cracked the wall I'd built around my grief. For the first time, I cried in public, unashamed. Those tears didn't burn. They washed. When I returned home, the house no longer felt haunted. It just felt lived in, honest, imperfect, real. I opened the window to let the wind carry whatever was left of the story away. The papers fluttered but didn't scatter. They'd already done their work. I walked through the hall one last time before dusk, pausing beside Ryan's sweater folded neatly in the study chair. I touched the fabric, smiled softly, and said, "You fixed it after all." The air didn't answer, but the silence was kind. The trial's echo lingered long after the courthouse emptied. Every street I passed seemed to hold faint fragments of the story, whispers folded into newspaper stands, nods from strangers pretending they hadn't read the headlines twice. I learned to walk through it, quiet and composed, the way one moves through the aftermath of a storm that destroyed everything but the foundations. For the first time in months, the phone stopped ringing. There were no more lawyers, no more statements, no more curious voices wanting to relive the horror. What remained was space unclaimed, unnervingly silent space where my rage used to live. I didn't know what to do with peace. It felt foreign, almost suspicious, like a truce I hadn't agreed to. Jonas called less now, though when he did, our conversations were simple, stripped of the heaviness that used to fill them. He'd send updates, the trust gaining attention, donations arriving, articles praising the cause. "You're a hero now," he said once, half joking. "You managed to turn a tragedy into something good." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "Heroes don't sleep with guilt, Jonas." He didn't argue. We both knew truth is quieter than legend. Sometimes, I'd catch him looking at me with that same guarded empathy he wore during the investigation, as if waiting for me to shatter again. But I didn't. I'd broken so completely that what grew back was sharper, steadier. There was no going back to who I'd been before Ryan's text. Months blurred into each other, soft-edged and bearable. The sea became my companion, a mirror that didn't lie. I visited the cliffs weekly, bringing flowers or sometimes just sitting, letting wind and water speak their wordless language. Tourists came now, taking photographs near the rail where Ryan's car once sat. They didn't know the story, not truly, just the version that made sense on paper. I didn't correct them. I'd learned that not all truth needs an audience. Once, I met an old fisherman there who nodded toward the horizon and said, "The sea doesn't take without reason. It returns things in its own time." I wanted to believe him. Maybe Ryan wasn't gone. Maybe he had simply become part of that vast, untamed silence I visited so often. The Hartman Trust grew faster than expected. Within 6 months, it had funded 3 major fraud recovery cases and 2 scholarships. Each success felt like a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. People began writing letters, survivors, widows, betrayed partners, all thanking me for giving their pain a voice. I read them at night, one by one, until they blurred together into a chorus of ache and resilience. Sometimes I'd whisper responses into the dark. "You're not alone. It gets quieter, I promise." Those words weren't entirely true, but they were kind, and kindness mattered more than accuracy now. Lauren's sentencing hearing came quietly, without the spectacle of the trial. She wore prison gray, her posture disciplined into acceptance. The judge spoke in measured tones about greed, deception, and remorse. She nodded at the right times, her eyes hollow but dry. When she turned to me, I saw no plea for forgiveness, only the dull understanding of someone who had finally met herself and didn't like what she saw. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Silence carried its own weight between us, a sentence beyond the court's reach. As she was led away, I felt no satisfaction, no joy, only a soft, tired release. Justice was never beautiful. It was just necessary. Afterward, I walked out into the cold sunlight and found Jonas waiting by the steps. "It's over," he said gently. "No," I corrected. "It's finished. Over is something you can walk away from." He smiled faintly, not arguing. "What will you do now?" I looked toward the horizon, the line where sky and sea touched like an unspoken promise. "Live, I think. Or try to." He nodded, and for the first time in years, he didn't offer advice. He just let me have the silence. Weeks later, I decided to leave the town for a while. I rented a small cottage inland, surrounded by pines and fog. The air there smelled different, clean, new, free of salt and memory. I spent mornings writing letters to donors, afternoons walking through quiet forests, evenings reading the old books Ryan loved. Sometimes I'd laugh at lines he used to quote, hearing his voice so clearly that it startled me. I still talked to him, though less out of grief and more out of habit. "You were right about everything," I'd say, setting a cup of coffee beside the window. "Even about me." The house would creak like it understood. One rainy night, I dreamed of him again. Not the drowning, not the fear, just Ryan standing under the old oak behind our childhood home. He was older, calmer, his eyes the same sharp blue they'd always been. "You kept your promise," he said simply. "So did you," I answered. And when I woke, the dream felt less like memory and more like blessing. I lit a candle by the window, not for mourning but gratitude. The flame burned straight and steady, unshaken by the wind that rattled the glass. Back in town, spring arrived early. The foundation hosted its first public gala, modest, quiet, deliberately human. The guest list included survivors, volunteers, and a few officials who had once dismissed our case. I wore a black dress Ryan had bought me years ago for a graduation party neither of us attended. When I took the stage to speak, my voice didn't shake. "This began as a tragedy," I told the crowd. "But sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to live better than the lie that killed them." There was applause, gentle and real. Jonas stood near the back, smiling like someone watching a wound finally close. After the event, I walked outside to the garden, shoes sinking slightly into soft soil. The air smelled of rain and lilac. I tilted my face to the sky and whispered, "You can rest now." No answer came, but peace didn't need words. For once, I didn't feel alone. That night, before sleep, I replayed Ryan's last message one final time, the text that started everything. "I'll fix it." I let the words fade, then deleted them, not out of anger but acceptance. He had fixed it, in his way, and I had finished it. The following morning, sunlight cut through the curtains like gold thread. I opened the windows wide and breathed deep. The world smelled new. There would still be moments of ache, flashes of what was lost, but they no longer owned me. The sea would keep its secrets, the land would hold its stories, and I would live among both, quiet but awake. Spring bled into summer before I noticed, the kind of quiet season that didn't announce itself with storms or endings. The cliffs grew wild with grass again, erasing the last outlines of police tape and footprints. The sea had softened too, rolling easy beneath the sunlight like something weary but still alive. I spent my mornings walking the path that curved above it, tracing old memories and watching the tide unmake them gently. Each step felt lighter than the one before, as though grief had been rinsed clean by time and salt. I began sketching again, not people or faces, but places, the house, the shore, Ryan's favorite stretch of road that led nowhere in particular. The sketches weren't perfect, but they felt honest, and that was enough. The Hartman Trust thrived without needing my constant attention now. I hired a small team of advocates who shared Ryan's stubborn sense of fairness. They worked late, laughed often, and called me Miss Hartman, even though I told them not to. I spent more time at the cottage, where mornings smelled of pine sap and quiet coffee. Sometimes letters arrived, small envelopes addressed in unfamiliar handwriting, stories from people I'd never meet. They thanked me for helping them reclaim homes, savings, hope. I kept every letter in a wooden box Ryan built when we were kids. It had once held seashells and bottle caps. Now it held testimonies of survival. Each note was proof that even pain, if shaped carefully, could build something enduring. Jonas visited often, always with that same tired kindness in his eyes. He never spoke of the trial anymore, only of small things, the weather, his dog, the new articles he was writing about corruption and reform. One evening, he brought a bottle of wine and said, "I think you've done what most people can't. You've ended a story without letting it end you." I smiled, pouring 2 glasses. "Maybe it's not about endings at all," I said. "Maybe it's just about knowing when to stop holding your breath." He laughed softly, clinking his glass against mine. "To Ryan?" he asked. I nodded. "To truth," I said. At night, the dreams came less often, and when they did, they didn't hurt. Sometimes I'd see Ryan walking beside me on the cliffs, silent but present, our steps in rhythm. Other times it was just the sea, vast and silver, endless and kind. I'd wake with a steady heart and write in my journal before dawn, small notes to the version of myself who had survived. I wrote about forgiveness not for Lauren or Delane, but for me. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't about letting go of anger. It was about deciding not to live inside it forever. By autumn, the town had turned my story into folklore. The cafe near the courthouse served a Justice Blend coffee named after the Hartman case. Tourists asked locals about the woman who found the truth, and someone always pointed vaguely toward the cliffs. I didn't correct them. Legends belong to listeners, not survivors. One day, an older woman stopped me outside the market. "I lost my son in a similar way," she said, voice trembling. "Thank you for not giving up when the world told fast." "You too." I touched her hand gently. "Neither did you," I said, and she smiled through tears. Moments like that became my quiet redemption, not headlines, not awards, but shared grief turned to understanding. The Hartman estate felt alive again. I opened its gates once a month for community gatherings, small concerts, book readings, fundraisers. The house that once echoed with betrayal now carried laughter, music, and the chatter of strangers who felt at home. The portrait of Father remained in the hallway, but next to it, I hung a new painting, one of Ryan standing on the cliffs, wind in his hair, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. I'd painted it myself, brush trembling but certain. Every visitor paused there, sensing its pull. Some asked who he was. I always said, the one who kept his promise. One evening, as the last guests left, I stood by the door, watching the lanterns sway in the wind. The house glowed warm behind me, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't waiting for anything, not answers, not closure, not ghosts. Everything that needed to happen had already happened. The rest was just living. I looked up at the stars scattered over the ocean and whispered, "I'm still here, Ryan." The wind answered softly, carrying lavender from the garden. Life didn't become perfect, it became real. There were still bad days, quiet mornings where memory pressed too close, moments when I'd reach for my phone before remembering there was no one to call. But those moments no longer hollowed me out. They simply reminded me of the depth of what once was. I learned that grief doesn't fade, it reshapes, like the sea against rock, carving something new from what was lost. The story people told about me always ended with justice, but the truth ended here in the gentle ordinariness of days. I tended the garden, brewed tea, painted, laughed, and sometimes cried. The world didn't owe me peace. I built it myself, one breath at a time. And maybe that was Ryan's final gift, not the mystery, not the revenge, but the understanding that life doesn't pause for fairness. It just continues, softer, quieter, wiser. If this story made you feel the way truth should, heavy, human, and healing, like share and subscribe. Because sometimes justice isn't about winning, it's about surviving beautifully.